Oi, fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn. Oh yeah.
Welcome to I Hate Roy Cohn, and so should you. How Roy Cohn ruined the world. This isn't a biography of a dead man, it's an autopsy of a living strategy. And today we're looking at the New Red Scare some more. Not really the kind with dossiers and gulags, but the kind that happens in the quiet spaces of a government office when a career civil servant's told they're no longer fit for the culture. Let's talk about the breach. Now see, the breach depends on treating every setback as someone else's fault, and the longer that explanation has to compete with people's lived experience, the harder it is, and the harder it becomes to sustain, really. Reality keeps adding receipts, and every promise, every policy, every measurable outcome just becomes another entry in the ledger. And over time, the argument isn't won by a single revelation, it's won or lost by accumulation. Every political movement has a word for victory, and democracy calls it an election. Campaigns call it momentum, and historians call it realignment. But authoritarian systems have a different vocabulary. They call it the breach. And that's the beauty of the Roy Cohn style inversion when it comes to today's conservative politicians, is it's not the constituents that are the people that they serve. They're there for the audience, for the performance. See, by insulting people or the representatives that they've chosen, he isn't alienating the base, he's signaling strength. And to the MAGA voter, the sneers aren't insults, they're promises. You see, when it says, I'm strong enough to be rude to the people who think they're better than you, what conservative people on talk shows do is that they transform a lack of basic decency into a weapon of class warfare. Think about Scott Jennings, for example. You know, he makes the act of being a bully feel like a victory for the little guy, all while he and the corporate landlord class continue to carve up the country behind closed doors. Like, let's look at like the spectacle of Senator Roger Marshall on Meet the Press. I mean, there's a masterclass in Roy Cohn gymnastics. The movement, he's just absolutely perfected the art of vibe-based reality. When pressed on the Save America Act, you know, the bill that's designed to curb the voting rights of demographics that don't lean red, well, Marshall didn't offer a single piece of advice, gang. He didn't need to. Instead, he pivoted to a vague atmospheric appeal to trust, comparing the act of voting to a pilot's license. Yeah, that's right. It was a logical fallacy wrapped in a patriotic bow, attempting to solve a problem that the Heritage Foundation itself admitted doesn't exist. And the conversation quickly devolved into a frantic dance of avoidance when confronted with the reality that wages are not outpacing inflation, and that the quote-unquote MAGA economy is merely a mechanism to compress the middle class while padding the pockets of the landlord class. Marshall retreated into the Trump negotiation style instantly. He framed the abandonment of housing promises not as a failure, but a strategic leverage point. See, it's the ultimate gaslight, telling the shivering homeowner that their foreclosure is actually a sophisticated tactical maneuver in a larger game of political chess. Then there's the mop-up operation in Iran. While the administration claims the war is over, the missiles are still flying 120 days into the fucking conflict. Like, Marshall's response was a textbook example of the movement's cognitive dissonance, and the war is over, yet we must strike back by 10. Like, what's up with this fucking contradiction here? See, it's a perpetual loop of aggression rebranded as peace, where the only constant is the demand that the public root for the Trump team. rather than ask why the bombs are still falling. See, in the world of the MAGA cell, the facts, inflation, failed promises, endless wars, they're merely liberal distractions from the only truth that matters, the perceived strength of the leader. The vibe-based reality isn't just a rhetorical trick, gang. It's used on cable news. It's the operating system of the new American state. See, when Senator Marshall compares voting to a pilot's license, he's performing a ritual of de-democratization. He's subtly introducing the idea that the right to participate in government is not an inherent birthright, but a privilege granted to those who are qualified, which is to say, those who are loyal. It's the Roy Cohn style dream, honestly, transforming the citizen into a petitioner, and this is how the rubble in the rot becomes invisible to the base by focusing the conversation on the vibe of strength in the theater of the deal. The administration ensures that no one is looking at the actual ledger. And while the public's arguing over whether the leader is tough enough, the corporate landlord class is quietly updating their lease agreements, pricing the middle class out of their own neighborhoods with the silent blessing of the state. And the aggression isn't a byproduct of the strategy, gang. It is the strategy. The noise of the conflict is designed to drown out the sound of the theft. Let me say that again. The noise of the conflict is designed to drown out the sound of the theft. Now let's go back to why they call this the breach. Not because public changed its mind, or because new ideas persuaded old voters, or not because democracy functioned exactly as designed. No. Because in this worldview, democracy is only legitimate when it produces the approved result. Anything else is interpreted as a systems failure, a breach, if you will. The breach isn't an event, it's a diagnosis. Imagine a hospital where every patient who gets healthier is treated as evidence that the doctors have lost control. I know it sounds fucking absurd, but yet politically, that's exactly what the breach does. The candidate wins and the public votes. The election is certified, and instead of asking why people supported that candidate, the system asks, who let this happen? Now notice the assumption. The voters never actually chose. Someone must have manipulated them. Someone infiltrated them. Somebody poisoned the system, because if ordinary people are capable of rejecting concentrated power on their own, the entire fucking mythology just collapses. See, the genius of the breach is that it permanently eliminates legitimate opposition, and your opponent can never simply win. They can only penetrate or persuade or infect. Their success becomes proof of their illegitimacy. It's a perfect closed loop. Every victory becomes evidence that the conspiracy is growing, and history is filled with different versions of this story. In 1798, the danger was foreign agents. In 1919, it was anarchists, and during the Cold War, it was communists. Today, the labels continue to evolve. But the architecture barely changes. Every generation is told that an ordinary political movement isn't actually political, it's existential. Ooh. The Red Scare is rarely a new invention. It's a dormant seed waiting for a convenient crisis to bloom, especially when you got an entire digital echo chamber who has no problem calling anything that's left of hunting the homeless for sport communism. See, the names change and the slogans change, the enemies change, but the underlying machinery, it remains remarkably familiar. Find a political movement that's beginning to accumulate genuine democratic influence, and then redefine that influence as evidence of infiltration rather than persuasion. Replace debate with emergency, and replace disagreement with suspicion. Once you replace voters with conspirators, that's Roy Cohn's exact game. He understood something that most politicians eventually discover, and that's that fear scales better than policy. You can argue over tax rates for hours. You only need one word to stop the entire conversation. And that word, communist, or traitor, enemy, or Marxist. See? The purpose of these labels, no, they're not scholarly accuracy, it's emotional compression. They transform disagreement into emergency, and once you've declared a breach, normal democratic rules become obstacles. Oversight becomes sabotage, and journalism becomes propaganda. Courts become enemies, universities become indoctrination centers, and civil servants become infiltrators. Members of Congress asking uncomfortable questions become threats, not because of what they asked, but because asking implies that the system owes someone an explanation. The breach rejects that premise. Power doesn't explain itself. Power demands confidence, and this is why Roy Cohn's rules matter. You never admit defeat, because admitting defeat means accepting that the public made a legitimate choice. Always attack, because every question delays the narrative, and always claim victory, because victory isn't measured by votes. It's measured by maintaining the appearance of inevitability. The breach changes the meaning of democracy itself. Democracy is no longer a process for resolving disagreement. It becomes a security perimeter. The election isn't about persuading citizens, it's about protecting the institution from citizens who voted incorrectly. That's why the term matters. The Red Scare describes the atmosphere, and DARVO describes the maneuver. The breach describes the moment that the system decides democracy itself has malfunctioned. It's the instant that political opposition ceases to be viewed as opposition and begins to be treated as unauthorized access. And that's the most dangerous inversion of all. Once every loss becomes evidence of infiltration, well, there's no longer any mechanism by which the public can legitimately reject power. And that's scary, because every defeat confirms the conspiracy. Every victory justifies another purge, and the breach is where democracy stops being a conversation and starts being treated like a firewall. And once a society reaches that point, the question is no longer who won. The question becomes who's still allowed to win. See, in the Roy Cohn style dictionary, gang, a progressive victory isn't just a loss of a seat, it's the breach. And when candidates like Mamdani start winning, when the rhetoric shifts from incremental change to corporate accountability and universal rights, the machinery of the new Red Scare doesn't engage in a policy debate, gang. It doesn't argue about the merits of rent control or the feasibility of a living wage. Instead, it triggers a systemic alarm. The fucking klaxons start going off, man, because the strategy is simple, like rebrand the success of the progressive left not as democratic evolution, but as Marxist infiltration of the American heartland. You see, that's the alchemy of atmospheric terror in real time. The moment that a progressive candidate secures a win, the movement pivots from political rivalry to existential war. They don't see a representative chosen by the people, they see a cell being activated. By framing these victories as a plague or a foreign-inspired coup, the administration justifies a preemptive strike, and it allows them to weaponize the fear of the other. You know, the infamous other, they, a worldwide conspiracy. And it's to ensure that the corporate landlord class, the very people funding the movement, remains untouched and unaccountable. The brilliance of this maneuver is that it creates a closed loop. And the more that these progressive candidates actually help people, the more they provide tangible relief to the squeezed middle class, the more that the Red Scare machinery screams infiltration into the digital soldiers. The sight of a winning socialist isn't the sign of a shifting zeitgeist, it's a signal that the deep state is finally surfacing. And the victory of the progressive is used as a primary evidence of the threat. And in the end, the new Red Scare doesn't need a secret police or a gulag. It only needs a loud enough scream to convince the terrified that the people trying to help them are the ones coming to take everything away. The most terrifying thing about the new Red Scare to me is that it doesn't need the trappings of a classic totalitarian state. You know, there's no midnight knocks on the door or secret police in leather coats and gulags in a frozen fucking tundra. I mean, closest thing we have to that is ICE. And the machinery and atmospheric terror is far more efficient because it's invisible. It doesn't shape public opinion through force, but through the calculated erosion of the very concept of a fair fight. It operates on a single poisonous premise that every electoral victory by the opposition isn't a reflection of the people's will, but evidence of a conspiracy. When a progressive candidate wins a seat or a grassroots movement, it gains traction, the Roy Cohn playbook doesn't see a democratic shift, it sees a glitch in the narrative, and that narrative has to be corrected. You see, gang, by reframing a standard electoral win as a breach or an infiltration, the movement successfully kills the idea of the opposition as a legitimate partner in governance. And once you've convinced enough people that their neighbor's vote is actually a signal for a foreign coup, the democratic process ceases to be a mechanism for progress and becomes a series of national emergencies. And in this world, compromise isn't a political tool, it's a confession of weakness. To negotiate is to surrender, and to concede a point is to betray the cause, and the new Red Scare transforms the ballot box into a battlefield, where the goal isn't to win the most votes, but to delegitimize the result before the first tally is even fucking counted. It's the ultimate Roy Cohn style victory, because a system where the only way to save democracy is to destroy the very rules that make it function. In the machinery of the state's often a dull, grinding process of memos and briefings, but when that machinery is steered by Roy Cohn's style appetite for dominance, the diplomatic process becomes a theater of aggression. Let's take the recent conference call regarding Iran, and a bipartisan gathering featuring Secretary Rubio and the envoy Steve Witkoff was ostensibly designed to discuss a 14-point memorandum of understanding, the MOU. However, the atmosphere was less about geopolitical strategy and more about the enforcement of loyalty, because Congresswoman Madeleine Dean attempted to pierce the veil of the MOU, asking the uncomfortable questions that the silent majority of the call avoided. Who actually wrote this document? Why does the language seem tilted in favor of Tehran? She pointed out that from the paragraph 1, the agreement was out of sync with American interests, but in the world of the current administration, a tough question is viewed as an act of insurrection. See, this is classic, gang, because Rubio's reaction was a textbook application of the accuse-the-accuser strategy, and rather than addressing the substance of the MOU, he pivoted to a personal attack. He branded Madeleine Dean as smart-assed and stupid before summarily cutting her microphone, basically a digital execution of her voice in a room full of her peers. The cruelty of the movement was underscored by the stakes. See, Madeleine Dean reminded the call, on the call, there's 13 service members have already died in this reckless, unconstitutional conflict. But thousands of civilians also caught in the crossfire across the region, and the response to this human cost was not a moment of reflection, but a fucking sneer. When Dean pushed further, asking Witkoff how much of his diplomatic time was actually spent on American interests versus his own private ventures, that's when the friction reached a breaking point, because the mic was cut again. It is a jarring display of the rubble and the rot. Government where the line between public service and private profit has been blurred into a smudge of corruption, and yet the most startling revelation, it didn't come from the call, but from the contrast. Because hours later, at a bipartisan dinner hosted by the embassies of Qatar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, the tone was hauntingly different. These regional powers spoke of a desire for stability and a pragmatic path towards peace, acknowledging the need for a secure Israel, while insisting that Palestine must have a state. And they viewed the MOU as a starting point for a functional, open, straight, goal of the prosperity and peace, but the contrast was stark. While the actual partners for peace were speaking the language of diplomacy and regional security, the administration's diplomats were behaving like playground bullies, using the cover of national security to mask a profound and honestly lack of competence and a surplus of arrogance. In the digital execution of Madeleine Dean's microphone, it's not just a lapse in manners, it's the Roy Cohn playbook evolving for the Zoom era. In the old days, you'd scream over someone or walk out of the room, and now you just simply revoke their access to the digital space. It's a precise, bloodless way of saying you no longer exist in the room where decisions are made. And when Rubio calls a congresswoman smartass for asking who wrote diplomatic memorandums, he isn't defending the MOU. He's signaling to every other person on that call that the cost of curiosity is social and professional annihilation. The rubble and the rot isn't just the corruption of the deal itself, but the decay of the process used to vet it. By cutting the mic, the administration doesn't just silence Madeline Dean, they signal to the digital soldiers that the only valid form of intelligence is absolute fealty. And the most damning part of that transcript isn't just the insults, it's the silence that follows the click of the mute button. That silence is where the actual governance happens now. Because when you remove the ability to ask who wrote this, you aren't just protecting a document, you're protecting the ghost of Roy Cohn. And he knew that if you can kill the question, you don't have to answer the truth. Rubio and Witkoff aren't playing a game of diplomacy, they're playing a game of territorial dominance. Don't forget Witkoff was in the Signalgate chat, in the fucking Kremlin when it went down. By treating a member of Congress like a nuisance in corporate HR meeting, they're effectively signaling that the legislative branch is no longer a check on power, but a spectator to it. The rubble and the rot is exactly that, the collapse of the institutional guardrails replaced by a hierarchy of loyalty where the only sin is being smart-assed enough to notice the corruption. Back to the breach. I think this is really our main focus of the day. It's the term, that's used when people actually start winning. Let's go ahead and just call it what it is. It's the term they use when people start winning. Because in the system, progressive victories aren't seen as democratic shifts or a change in public opinion. It's treated as security failures. You know what I mean? See, when candidates like Mondani win by focusing on corporate accountability and universal rights, and the response isn't a policy debate over rent control or wages. Instead, the whole Marxist infiltration line comes out. And the most dangerous part of the new Red Scare is that it operates by eroding the idea of a fair fight. Every victory by the opposition is reframed as a conspiracy, and the compromise is treated as a betrayal of the cause. The mask doesn't just slip, it falls off entirely when they think the cameras are off, and this is the reality of the rubble and the rots. When the public is fed a narrative of national security and fighting the deep state, the actual work is the systematic erasure of any record that could lead to a courtroom. The digital execution of Congresswoman Madeline Dean, it wasn't a dress rehearsal for the digital execution of the evidence itself. I mean, that's all it was. As they laugh in that room, the cost is measured in the lives of the 13 service members and the thousands of civilians who are now nothing more than footnotes in a failed diplomatic gamble. I'm telling you, gang, the machinery of the new Red Scare has reached its final form, and it's a government that no longer fears the truth because it has convinced itself that the truth is a form of treason. Just remember, let's look at those phantom promises once more, affordable housing, and, let's look at these sites. They were marketed as the vanguard of new accessible urban living. A gift to the squeezed middle class, but the Roy Cohn pivot is a masterclass in the art of the pivot. The funding didn't vanish, it simply was redirected, and the affordable units were quietly rebranded as luxury boutique spaces. The zoning laws were twisted in the dark, and the people who were promised a home were left with a construction fence and a coming soon sign that never changed. This is where the Red Scare meets the real estate ledger. When the displaced families began to organize and when the digital soldiers realized their own rent was the fuel for the machine, the administration didn't offer a rebate, they offered a villain. Suddenly, the protests against the luxury condos weren't seen as a housing crisis. They were framed as Marxist disruptions designed to destabilize the local economy. And the movement didn't just fail to deliver housing. It weaponized the failure to create a new sense of urgency, telling the homeless that their only hope was to fight the quote-unquote socialist agitators who dared ask why the cranes had stopped moving. See, I'm telling you, by reframing the Democratic win as a hostile penetration of the system, the administration has transformed the voters' will into a symptom of a disease. And compromise is no longer a tool of government, it's surrender to the enemy. So, when politics reaches the stage of the breach, the battle's no longer over which policies are going to prevail, but over who's even allowed to participate in the conversation. The question shifts from how do we fix the housing crisis to does this person even belong in our republic? Once the contest moves from policy to legitimacy, the rules of the game cease to be protections. They become obstacles to be dismantled in the name of saving the very democracy that they're currently destroying. And that's why when you get a 10-minute filibuster, always ask the same thing. Present your evidence. And fuck Roy Cohn. Go to skipfranzjr.net for podcasts.
Record player that I could just spin records all the time.
I run into the bathroom and I'm covered in blood. Like I had put my tooth through my bottom lip.
For music. For gaming and pro-liberty game rants. That's skipfranzjr.net.
Oi, fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn.
Fuck Roy Cohn. Oh yeah.